is that influencers can be both great in terms of influencing people, but they may also be a danger because they can influence people. And I think as Smith may not stray far from those perspectives.
Esto es La Inquietud con Garret Edwards, el lugar donde hay más preguntas que certezas.
Damos vuelta de página aquí en La Inquietud por CNN Radio Rosario. Hoy tenemos un enorme honor, placer y privilegio. Ella es politóloga por la Universidad Católica del Sacro Cuore en Italia. Es máster y doctora en Economía por la George Mason University en los Estados Unidos de América. Es profesora universitaria y es una de las más grandes expertas del mundo en Adam Smith. No solamente eso, sino que también es una de las coeditoras de uno de los libros de referencia más importantes que tienen que ver con este autor exponente de la ilustración escocesa, el Oxford Handbook con Adam Smith, por ejemplo, y es un placer tenerla aquí con nosotros. Es la doctora Maria Pia Paganelli, con quien vamos a estar ahora hablando en inglés. Maria Pia, so pleased to have you here with us. Garret Edwards on the other side.
Muchas gracias, Garret. The introduction was extremely flattering. Thanks so much. And thanks so much for having me here. It's a great pleasure.
Thank you for joining us. And Maria Pia, so many things to discuss, so many issues to touch. Adam Smith, an author that keeps coming back, that always gives us new gifts and new things to think in our current nowadays and in our present. I would like to touch upon some things that are maybe not the usual stuff to discuss about Adam Smith. For example, Adam Smith and current technologies, Adam Smith and social media and influencers. What would you think Adam Smith would say about all those things had he had the chance of experiencing them?
Those are very difficult questions, not only because, of course, Smith lived almost 3 centuries ago, so the technology he had available was not the same as we have today. And so the kind of textual support of what I could try to answer is not going to be present. So I'm just inferring from what Smith had said. So for as far as technology, my guess is that can be a positive thing in terms of markets, because technology allows us to expand our markets. And one of the main points that Smith makes in The Wealth of Nations is that as market expand, we are more able to divide our labor and therefore to be more productive. And the division of labor is one of the main sources of our wealth. And so if technology allows us to expand the markets, we are able to specialize more, to divide labor more, and therefore to be more productive, and therefore to be wealthier. And then you mentioned influencers. Did I say right?
Yeah, exactly.
In terms of influencer, this I think is more of a challenge, because one of the fears that we have today, I think, is that influencers can be both great in terms of influencing people, but they may also be a danger because they can influence people. And I think as Smith may not stray far from those perspectives, in the sense that as long as an influencer is seeking praise as opposed to praiseworthiness, that may actually cause some problems, because the focusing exclusively on praise rather than praiseworthiness may lead us astray on our choices and our behavior and our conduct. And so I fear that Smith would fear that if influencers focus a lot on praise as opposed to praiseworthiness, that may not be the best use of technology. And also, if the people that follow the influencer follow their praise as opposed to try to be praiseworthy, then again, that may not be the best use of technology.
That's a really interesting point, Maria Pia. You just made me think with the being praised and praiseworthy on the idea of people that try to get more likes, or they try to get more views, and it's like this mirror that we might be putting in front of us, whether people are trying to be loved or to be lovely when they are on the internet, and that's a really fundamental question, right?
Right. And I think for Smith, we want to be lovely as well as loved, but we want to be loved because we are lovely. Right? We want to be praised because we are indeed praiseworthy. And if you give praise, or if you receive praise without being praiseworthy, that causes an internal conflict, according to Smith, that makes you uncomfortable because you know that you don't deserve that praise.
Connecting to also things that have been taking place in the past few decades with globalization and with multiculturalism, what do you think Smith would be thinking about all those things that maybe he was already thinking in a way way back when, but now we have it with such strong force?
This is another very difficult question. I can give you my opinion, which is definitely not necessarily the only opinion on this. But the way I read Smith is that he sees there are universal tendencies in human nature, so that there are certain characteristics of human beings that are shared universally. Yet, the environment in which we live is going to give different incentive and different structure to how we express ourselves. And so we may develop different customs, we may develop different traditions, we may develop different things that are approved and approvable in different societies because of the environment is going to be different. And that doesn't imply that one is necessarily better than the other or superior to another. It simply means that those kind of cultural systems are appropriate for that particular context, and it may not be appropriate in a different context. Okay? So if you think of the unwillingness to express your emotion, that is something that may be more typical in certain kind of society than other society. And in some society, your unwillingness to express your emotion may be seen as a negative thing, like you're a cold person, like you don't react, like you lack empathy. But in other situations or in other context or in other culture, the expression of emotion would be seen something inappropriate. Just because the context is different. So I think that Smith can address multiculturalism in a very respectful way, in the sense that he would see that different cultures may develop because of different conditions, and they would be appropriate for those conditions, but not necessarily for others. So I wouldn't say, like, sometimes Smith is accused of relativism, and I wouldn't go that way, in the sense that it's not that all cultures or all, that all cultures are equivalent, but each culture may be appropriate for that particular context and not for others.
Talking about different contexts, Maria Pia, and I guess I must not have been the only one. Back in January 2020 and in March 2020, I could not help but remember the example of the earthquake in China and whether we would be worried about what was happening in the other side of the world. We could sleep calmly, but if we knew that they were going to remove and cut our small finger or small toe, we would not be able to rest at all. Would Smith be worried about the pandemic? Where do you think he would stand right now with all these big discussions that have been taking place for the past 2 years?
So the example that that you just gave about the little finger that will not let me sleep tonight if I knew that I was going to lose my little finger tomorrow, and knowing instead that there may be an earthquake, or there will be an earthquake in China. China is like the farthest.
The place he could think, okay, right. So this is the farthest I could go in the 18th century, right?
Exactly. So it's nothing against China itself. It's just an example to say the people that are the most remote from you, that you have no idea about them, no contact whatsoever. If the whole population that is so far away from you is going to be destroyed by an earthquake, you're going to sleep without problems. But he continues and says, but if you were asked to give up your little finger to save that population from destruction, he says, no villain on earth would ever keep their fingers and let the entire population of this very, very far away place be completely destroyed. Because like you just couldn't live with that shame. So that tells us that, yes, we may care more about ourselves than others, but yet there is something about putting ourselves in front of others that is seen as shameful and therefore prevents us from harming others explicitly in a massive way.
We wouldn't get in front of people trying to get in the lifeboats in the Titanic, right? At least we wouldn't want to be seen doing so.
Exactly. Exactly. Now with the pandemic, this is a very challenging situation, because we have seen a lot of I'm going to give up my little finger to help you. Meaning we have seen a lot of solidarity, a lot of people helping each other, because the pandemic put a lot of people in very distressful situation, and both financially and emotionally. And a lot of people step up to it and help others, both financially and emotionally. On the other hand, we have seen a lot of fracturing of society because of how people reacted to some regulation or some proposed regulations. And that, again, is a problem that Smith sees, because we want to be approved and approvable, but we get that approval from a specific group, from our group. And if our group is in contrast with another group because we approve of different things, then you may actually have what Smith called factions and clashes among factions that would eventually lead, in his case, in the way in which he describes it, to civil war. And so I think that the mechanism that he explains, or that he presents us with in Theory of Moral Sentiments, kind can explain both the positive things that came out of the pandemic as well as negative things.
There's this idea that Smith poses that I love, that I would not be able to explain as well as you would, which is the impartial spectator, because you were saying, you were talking about seeking approval from others, and we have this little mechanism of trying to see what would an impartial spectator would think or say about the things that we do. I'm not sure whether there is a relation or not, but would you see some kind of link with Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, or are they completely unrelated when it comes to impartial spectator?
So the impartial spectator is something I can talk about. Kant, I cannot, unfortunately. So I can tell you what I understand about impartial spectator, but
was that your impartial spectator or your categorical imperative when answering that?
I think it's actually my ignorance more than anything.
Like Socrates said, now that we can say that we know nothing, it's when we know stuff, right?
In the case of Kant, it's like I really just don't know. I don't know enough to be able to give you a good answer. I was trained as an economist after all, so that is on the side.
But what about the impartial spectator?
Yeah.
What do you think? It's still a useful idea, a useful tool to try and position in the place of others?
I think it's a very important tool that Smith offers us to understand several things about human beings. The first thing is that we are a social beings, and radically social, meaning that it is impossible to think of ourselves as by ourselves, as as isolated in that sense, like without a social context. We are social creature. Everything that we do, everything that we are, according to Smith, is determined through the presence of others. So much so that even if we don't have another in front of us, we have another inside us that help us define ourselves. And so that impossibility of being in isolation is exacerbated from the presence of this impartial spectator, which is the man inside the breast, as Smith says. So even if nobody watches me physically, there is somebody that is indeed watching me and judging me and approve me or disapproves me. And that, again, I think is a very strong presence that underlines our sociability and how it is impossible for us to think of ourselves as isolated beings. That said, the impartial spectator plays a fundamental role in developing ourselves, because through society, because the impartial spectator is a person, even if it's an imaginary person, is still a person that allows us to confront ourselves with the customs, the habit, the things that are seen as approvable of our society, of our group, or even of our factions, as I was mentioning before. So the impartiality of the impartial spectator is a big question mark, because it is always somebody who is voicing the presence of our own community, and that may be a tiny one in conflict with another one, but may also be a larger community instead that allows us to indeed develop this impartiality so that we can judge ourselves without systematic biases.
You mentioned Maria Pia. the man inside the chest, I'm going to ask you about another man. Actually, when I spoke once to Deidre McCloskey, she said the woman in the system as well. Should we still be worried about the women in the system, as where Smith might have put it if he were writing in the 21st century?
So the way in which he presents it, at least, is the man of system. This is what you're asking, right? Yeah,
exactly.
It's the person who's enamored of his own view, and is hoping and attempting to change the word so that it fits its own view. Should we be worried about it? I don't see why not, in the sense that human nature hasn't changed, I think, since Smith's time. And so if in my ideal world, and I really would love to see a world in which everybody is an angel, and I want to structure society so that people, the angel people that I think they are, act in a certain way, then, but we are not necessarily angels all the time. And so that would actually cause conflict between my view and my institutions with the actual behavior of people. And so even if I mean well and try to structure society in a way that reflects my ideal view, I may actually cause harm, because I am addressing people who behave differently from how I wish they behaved.
In 2018 in Chile, for the International Smith Conference, Maria Pia, you presented a paper which discussed whether Smith was or not a Stoic, which is a discussion that is still taking place among Smith scholars. Would you like to share some of those insights that you researched when you wrote that paper?
Right. So this paper is co-authored with a colleague called Michele V. And basically what we think is that Smith was not a Stoic. And Smith was actually criticizing the people who wanted to be Stoic in a period that was not Stoic. Meaning, I think I mentioned it before, there are certain behaviors or certain kind of conducts that are appropriate in certain contexts, but not in others. And Stoicism, the way in which we read it, is a kind of behavior that is or a philosophy that is appropriate for what Smith called savage societies, and not for what Smith calls commercial societies. So a savage society, again, these are words that today sound very odd just because it's offensive to say to somebody, you're a savage. But in Smith's time, the way in which Smith uses it is not meant to be offensive, is meant to refer to a society of hunter-gatherers, a society in which people live in extreme poverty. People struggle to stay alive on a daily basis. So constantly, from when they're born to when they die, they're facing the threat of death because of the dangers or because of the lack of resources. And in an environment in which you have to face constantly the threat of death, and of a painful, violent death. It's not like, oh, I'm just gonna go to sleep and die. It was actually like you could be attacked the way in which is presented. Like you can be attacked by other people, you can be attacked by animals, you can starve to death, you can get sick and die. So they're very painful ways of dying. To to be able to face the constant threat of death, you have to be able to suppress the expression of emotions. And the way in which we read Stoicism is, again, this ability to have a straight face in front of whatever situation you encounter. And for Smith, the ability not to express any of your emotion, to have a straight face all the time in front of your children, your spouse, your enemies, your torturer, you're still not going to show any emotion, is something that is appropriate for that particular context, a context of continuous struggle between life and death, but it's not something that is appropriate for a context in which things are more relaxed. Like you actually, it describes as like, he contrasts the tempest with like a sunny, warm day. And if you are in an environment in which you are comfortable, you don't have to struggle constantly to have food on your table, you don't have to work constantly about, will I be able to get to the end of the day without dying? Will my children get to the end of the day without dying? If you are in that kind of environment, then you're able to develop what Smith calls more a humanity as a feeling. And so you're able to express yourself more, you express your emotion more, and to share those emotions with others. And that sharing of emotion with others is, for Smith, something that is very pleasurable, and is something that allows us to be more fulfilled in a commercial society. But it would be completely inappropriate on a battlefield. For example, a battlefield is an example in in Smith's contemporary society in which you're facing death constantly, and therefore Stoicism would be appropriate.
So, but please continue. Maria.
No, but say in court in France, no, you can cry openly without any problems.
So much food for thought there about Adam Smith. Stoicism or non-Stoicism, as you mentioned. Two more questions, and we won't rob you of any more time today. And one that I'm going to be vocal about my experience. I had the luck of visiting Edinburgh twice in my life, and some of the highlights of my visit to Scotland were actually seeing Adam Smith's statue, seeing David Hume's statue as well. And we have seen some small groups campaigning in the last few years against those places, those memorials. Would you like to say something about that, Maria Pia?
So those kind of movements, which are sometimes called cancel culture, in which they want to remove symbolism of events of the past that are troublesome, can be, in a sense, appropriate under certain circumstances, right? So think of somebody who would erect a statue of Hitler in a public place. I think people would not be comfortable with having a statue of Hitler in a major square. And so if we are uncomfortable with a Hitler statue, then we can be uncomfortable also with statue that remind us of, or that celebrate the life of people who have done significant crimes in their lives. They may have done good things as well, but they also have done significant crimes. So I think that there is something positive about the idea of reconsidering history with a perspective that is broader than what we had done so far. On the other hand, that doesn't mean that we should swipe out everybody or everything that was under that a specific period of time. And so for Adam Smith in particular, yes, he lived in Imperial Britain, which had slaves and made empire in part because of their slaves. But on the other hand, he was not a promoter of slavery under any possible ways. He was not a promoter of hierarchy, natural hierarchy of people. So there's some people are naturally superior to others. That's not what Smith said. Smith was actually criticizing heavily those kind of positions. So both in his Wealth of Nations and his Theory of Moral Sentiments, he goes to great length to describe all human beings exactly in the same way. So much so that it tells us that all differences come exclusively from nurture and not from nature. So much so that until the age of 6 or 8, not even your parents are able to distinguish you from another child. That's a very radical statement that Smith is making. And then he continues in saying, is you're going to develop differences after the age of 6 or 8, because that's when you start to work. At this time,
labor laws back then was like that.
But nevertheless, like is your context, your environment that will determine the differences in you, and not your nature. So it's very, and nowhere in the Wealth of Nations and TMS, Interior Moral Sentiments, he relies on natural differences. So his radical egalitarianism is fundamental to his understanding of human beings and human nature. And his condemnation of both slavery and the British Empire are also remarkable. The Wealth of Nations can be seen as a strong, very, very strong condemnation of the British Empire, because it's an empire based on mercantilist policies. And slavery is part of it. So to condemn and try to remove Smith's statue, I think is completely, or at least it is inappropriate, because it is based on a stereotype that anybody in the 18th century must have been supporting slavery or racial-based slavery. And that's not the case. There were people who were not in favor of slavery. Smith was the author that was actually used to push for anti-slavery and accused by pro-slavery authors. So I think that there is a point in trying to remove offensive people from public spaces, but we have to be careful in identifying the correct people to remove and not everybody.
Maria Pia, we have the last question. This one we ask all of our interviewees. The show is named La Inquietud in Spanish, which is actually a pun, because in English it could either mean the question, or we could also translate it as something akin to restlessness. So we're going to use just one of those versions for the question. What makes Maria Pia Paganelli restless?
This question makes me restless. Because I don't know how to answer it. So I think that probably is a major cause of restlessness, being faced with a question that I don't know how to answer. That I don't know how to answer. And that's different than saying is a question for which I don't know the answer. No, I mean, it to me makes a big difference. Because if you have a question for which you don't know the answer, but you know where to find the answer, to whom you ask, then it's okay. But a question like what makes me restless is like, I don't know where to go for that answer. And so that makes me restless because I don't know how to approach that question. Let me rephrase this. I don't know. What makes me restless is what I don't know how to answer and how to get to an answer, as opposed to I just don't know the answer because I can get to the answer otherwise.
Maria Pia, thank you very much for all this time that you have shared with us today. We are really thankful, and the audience must be so as well. We send you a big hug here from Argentina.
Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure. It was wonderful to be here with you. Thanks.
La teníamos a la doctora Maria Pia Paganelli aquí en La Inquietud por CNN Radio Rosario.
Esto fue La Inquietud con Garret Edwards. Síguenos en redes sociales y en www.edwards.com.ar.